Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very special episode of Open Up the Workforce. I'm Ahva Sadeghi, your host, co-founder, and CEO of Symba. Today, we are doing our first ever live recording of Open Up the Workforce, and shout out to JFF for making this possible. I'm here with Nikita Steals, someone that I truly admire and look up to as a powerhouse, a trailblazer in our industry. Nikita Steals is the founder and CEO of Northwest Talent Solutions. She's had over 25 years of experience as a leader in talent acquisition, human capital strategies, and working at some companies that might be familiar to you, like Amazon, Capital One. Nikita, this space right now, the world of DEI, what is happening? You have been in the media, you've been in the news, I've been seeing all the traction. Can you create and really level set with our audience right now?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be here at the summit and to be talking with you all at Symba. So thank you first for that. I think what's happening in the market and in terms of the corporate market and in the world, candidly, is a shift around these concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Typically within corporate America, we see representations of the greater society. So as society has really grappled with this topic of DEI in a socio-political sense, we've seen organizations internally also grapple with what to do and how to do best around these issues. So we see organizations doubling down. Some of our biggest clients are doubling down. We see the article with Sephora, for instance, that's really been able to take a major stand and show the major value proposition around sticking with diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. And we see other organizations that are struggling in analysis paralysis around what's compliant and how to have these uncomfortable dialogues with organizations. And here's where we come in as experts and consultants to help manage the emotions around the topic and then help organizations to mechanize against the disparities within their talent funnels.
That's incredible. And I sincerely appreciate the work that you're doing. I think it's more important now than ever.
Sure.
Can you share a little bit more about your story, your career, what has led you to this work?
Sure. Well, I mean, I was very fortunate to have found my calling early, back in the late 90s. I had strongly considered going into public service, but then ended up taking a temporary role with Management Recruiters International as a junior recruiter. And as it happened, very serendipitously, I ended up doing extremely well in a short period of time as a junior recruiter and ended up staying in contingency search for 7 years before going into corporate to develop and cultivate strong value propositions for organizations to attract the market's top talent. So overall, over these 25 years, I've led at PricewaterhouseCoopers, leading their assurance and tax recruiting, was a global leader for Conduent, leading all of their commercial and public sector recruiting across all of the general job families, including tech and operations and human resources, essentially the gamut, and became Amazon's largest infrastructure talent acquisition leader globally across tech, which then I also took a role as a principal DEI consultant with Amazon and put together a major DEI strategy that became a beacon in the organization I was working for within Amazon. And then lastly, within corporate, I was with Capital One as their vice president, leading all of their tech talent acquisition and helping them to expand globally into Mexico City and to build upon their India location of data labs. It was there that AI came to the forefront within the last, if you look at the years, 21 through now. Over these last 2 years, AI has become an essential element to what we're doing in tech. Happy to see Capital One's progress as a leader in bringing in AI and machine learning talent. So much of AI as a topic is changing the world and has a direct correlation to how we can humanize our work in the human capital and DEI topics as well.
That's exciting. And for those of you who don't know, Nikita is a 3-time founder. and true trailblazer in the sense of adopting and embracing technologies. That's why my co-founder, Nikita, and I have really appreciated the partnership and work that we've been able to do together because of how you embrace technology. Sure. And you're really forward thinking with AI. I think that when we see AI being sometimes used within HR, we're excited, but we want, I think, people to push on and go faster, right? Really embrace this opportunity in this moment. And we talk about, and you talk about ethical AI quite a bit. And I have so many questions.
Sure.
So can you at least just, what is ethical AI and how do we even identify what it is?
Sure. Well, the only way that technology can be ethical is if the maker of the technology is ethical. Uh-huh. It's really important to be able to test whether a system has been evaluated, assessed toward mitigating disparity. When it comes to human capital, there are ways to do that everywhere in the funnel, from top, mid, through the bottom funnel. It's just really important that technologists are calibrated around inclusion prior to developing these programs that are going into our big organizations across the world. Absolutely. That's a simplified explanation.
Yeah, and I think that's the starting point, really, that the person and the group that is doing it is good and they attempt to be ethical. But then also, I think we need to have some sort of like guardrails and understanding, okay, well, these are the outcomes and how do we course correct, right?
Absolutely. It's internal controls, it's testing, it's remediation, it's evaluating, it's continuous improvement. And it's also, when it comes to organizations around people strategy, typically the only way that we can get to the truth is through data and anecdote. Mm-hmm. So you're going to be looking at representation within organizations, for one, but we also should be evaluating parity and promotion cycles and attrition, and whether there are hotspots in the business that are more susceptible to what looks like disparity. It would need to be meaningful data sets that would then inform our continuous calibration towards the intention of equitable outcomes.
Absolutely. So I think that it's important that we measure this so much. And something crazy recently happened. One of my good friends gave me a call. She was super excited, and she said, "Ahva, I just had an entire interview with AI." And I was like, "What do you mean?" She had a phone call interview with an AI agent companion during the call. And she said it was the first time. She has a heavy accent. She's moved to the United States and did her master's here. And so she said, this is the first time I really felt like I wasn't judged during the interview. And I got great feedback and it was incredible. And I was kind of surprised. I was like, I don't know if that would have been my response. But, when we think about bias-free and how AI could be used for good, I love your perspective there.
Sure. Again, it comes down to the awareness and the effort of programmers and technologists to ensure that we're doing everything possible to mitigate against bias. The first thing we have to do, which can be difficult and makes us feel very uncomfortable and vulnerable, is to admit that we all have bias. Mm-hmm. It's a coping mechanism within our central nervous systems as human beings. We have to make conclusions in order to deal with the amount of stimulus that comes into our psyche on a day-to-day, sometimes minute to minute. So if we're brilliant technologists, then we first have to understand that human mind. So standing in proxy for organization as that voice and being that mediator and being able to identify very specific areas of bias, making recommendations, grabbing that data set and saying, here's the gap, here's the risk, and here's a way that we can start to fix it prior to enabling additional talent into the organization.
That's really exciting. And it gives me a lot of hope for what this could be used for, the positive implications of it as well. I am really excited to also get your hope and vision for what you're seeing, hopefully some shifts. I know we talked when we first were discussing this podcast together. I shared with you that I felt defeated as some of the work that we're doing in the space. And I feel like I see the news and research came out that about 60% of the roles of chief diversity officers have declined, switched. There's a lot of turnover. But you said, Ahva, there's still hope, and you gave me some great words. So I'd love for if you could share that with our listeners.
Absolutely. What it comes back to is a shift. And the shift has clearly caused some chaos. And this has been over the past 2 to 3 years, particularly since the George Floyd murder. It has, so the topic had gone more towards a moral imperative, so political debate item. We got away from the pure good sense that it makes to have a strong culture of diversity and equity and inclusion. We know how it compounds profit. We know how innovation soars in organizations that are more diverse. So I think it's really important as we move through this conversation during this shift to try to steer away from the emotionalism of it all. And I know that can be difficult because we're human, but really get to the systems of it all and to be talking about ways to create systems to ensure the intention of equitable outcomes. We also have to look at media, right? On the topic, the media has been, it has its major benefits for us to keep us informed, but we also know the power of the media can drive emotion. It can drive societal divides. When we see headlines like, for instance, Meta has let go of all of its DEI team. In that same week, Meta had let go of major parts of its workforce overall,
Yes.
in terms of engineers, in terms of human resources and talent acquisition. Holistically, post-COVID-19, organizations needed to level set because there had been a tremendous amount of hiring and budget expenditure that they then needed to right-size after COVID-19. But because the topic is so sensational, then we get into these conversations. One of the things I know that large corporations had done in a lot of this downsizing around agile technologists and full stack engineers, along with DEI, they had placed mandates internally that a large percentage of their talent acquisition teams needed to be DEI trained, which when it comes down to creating a more holistic people strategy, it's unfortunate about the downsizing, but the work inside of corporate then becomes a lot more congruent around ensuring DEI solutions are integrated into the talent acquisition practices.
Yes, and I appreciate that perspective so much so, because if it's actually working, if D&I is ingrained in our systems, then it doesn't need to be siloed off into its own entity, right? It can be part of what we're doing in so many ways. But I also will push back a little bit because I noticed that even in Texas and some of the states, the states are banning some of these words. And I'm from San Antonio, Texas, and the word D&I is scrubbed from all of these websites, and universities. So maybe how can we think through some of those challenges? Right.
I like that pushback because it's a good conversational piece about some folks, the shift causing some ambiguity in some places, the shift causing some fear in some places. In the state of Texas, where DEI or whatever acronym that they're using, there's still a double down of the OFCCP to ensure equal access and equal opportunity. There's still employment and labor law and civil rights.
Yeah.
So the topic of itself does not negate the legality of it, the essential legalities of ensuring equal employment. Just as we have political divides across the United States, we see what's happening in the South. You mentioned Texas. There's also Florida that's really struggling with this topic. But we also see in the Northeast, we see the Midwest and certainly the West of the United States that has doubled, tripled down and began to really even disaggregate data sets to show that this movement continues. This attention to creating an equitable environment does continue.
Yes, and I think with movement, we see that every time there is a movement, there's shifts forward and backward.
Yes.
The key is that we're still making progress forward. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like even though these organizations have been right-sized and there have been some shifts, we've still been making progress and moving forward.
We have still been making progress and moving forward. When you see organizations like your Capital One, BlackRock, Sephora, Disney, Baker Tilly, Man Group, these are industry leaders in their own right that have not only continued in this pursuit of inclusion and equity within their environments, but have made very external statements and stances about the need and the value of doing so.
Yes. And how do we maybe make some of these systems more tangible? So if you could share with our audience as far as moving to more the systems approach that you mentioned, what are some tangible ways of doing this? Like maybe how do you work with some of your customers and clients to do this?
It's not a one-size-fits-all. Each organization will have its own challenges. I mean, there are some clients that would need support in understanding how to create a more belonging job requisition. Or there are some who need help understanding what data is compliant and with whom it should be shared. Just for the sake of simplicity here, I would say that at the top of funnel for talent acquisition, whenever posting here in the United States, typically there are 27% of viable respondents to the average requisition. And when you look toward technology or finance, then we understand that from a representation perspective, there's generally less underrepresented people being pushed to the mid-funnel. One can argue, well, there are less in the United States, and that's for sure. That's the difference between a minority and a majority. But as it relates to the top of funnel, one very impactful mechanism is to ensure that within I call it to keep your house clean. And what it means is a requisition is posted, and every 3 to 5 days, every candidate within that applicant pool has been assessed and screened, because then it doesn't become just a numbers game. If it's just a numbers game and it's just a race against the clock, because the way the numbers are, you're going to have a slate of candidates that is more majority. In order to mechanize against disparity, you actually have to mitigate against it. You have to cause it to happen. It doesn't mean that anyone's nefarious. It doesn't mean that people don't want underrepresented people in their organization. It means that the way the numbers work out and the way the average applicant tracking system is set up, you have to cause equitable review of every candidate that comes into that pipeline. That then informs what happens at middle. How many folks are interviewed? How many folks are receiving offers? How many, and so on and so forth. And we can prescribe at any area in the funnel, but that is one area that typically has been very effective.
So I hear you loud and clear that there needs to be some sort of mechanism, but how do we ensure those mechanisms are equitable, right? Is there some example that you can give me, at least when you talk about screening from the first funnel to the next, to the mid funnel? How do we ensure that it's fair and it feels right, that process?
Well, there's action inside of an organization like the equitable review. If 50 candidates did apply, then 50 candidates will be reviewed prior to having them submitted to the mid-funnel. There's also technology to help support that. There's unconscious bias training that my organization is certainly calibrated on, and many of the organizations that I led, if it wasn't there, then it was implemented there. Each applicant tracking system does have its own nuance. So it's quite subjective, Ahva, candidly, to talk about each system and what to do within each system. The intention to gather data on applicant pool, applicant throughput, looking at that data and being very clear and honest on where the gaps are, where the red spots are, and then actioning against those wherever they are is really the idea.
Yes. So you're signaling and then you're creating an action plan and mitigating and resolving based off of that.
Absolutely. It's like you would handle issues in your organization that are causing trepidation. If organizations were not able to get their product out to the customer base in a timely and cost-effective way, then they would deep dive. They would take the data. They would look at potential resources to mitigate against these issues. They would make recommendations and measure outcomes moving forward to ensure that the issue solved itself over time.
Yes, just like any real business challenge, this is also a business imperative that needs to be resolved and solved for.
It's one of the number one risks to an organization. We, again, coming back to the point of moving away from DEI being a moral imperative, we can't talk to each other as humans about what we're supposed to believe. And I can't tell you who to love and tell you who to accept. I can't do that personally or professionally. I don't have the right. If we're in an organization where there's a shared culture and there is a mission and a vision and an organization that we are to uphold, and we have a people strategy that is to serve the community and serve the greater world, that's something we have to agree on. So from a business perspective, what it's coming down to, one, it mitigates risk to have a diverse and equitable environment. I mean, if we want to talk about the governing laws of it, that's one thing. But if we're in business, then we also ought to be good business people that understand the resources and growth mindset and innovation required to drive profitable business. And in this case, it happens to be a sound, holistic people strategy.
Yes. In the article that you shared with me this morning, it said that global spend for diverse folks around the world is around $16 trillion, and it's $4 trillion domestically. And you said something that I actually find to be somewhat bold. You said this is the number one risk for businesses. Why would you say that?
Well, if you look at some of the major class action suits that we have seen in one of our biggest companies in the world over the past 4 to 5 years, we always look at race as one of the things that folks are looking at. That's one of the major areas of contention. But we're also seeing a lot in terms of sexuality, in terms of gender, even veteran status, people with disabilities, even neurodiverse people. As this world evolves and we start to understand that this being human at work is more than what it used to be. It's more than just going into an office and producing a product and maybe punching a time clock. And this is about contributing to an organization that is serving the world and has responsibilities to the greater society, to the government, and to the world as a whole. There's so much conversation about what's occurred in work since COVID, for instance, when we had the Great Resignation. And then we had a tremendous amount of volatility in markets with the downsizing. We're in this gray space now, but the same conversation about inclusive leadership, about human rights, about equitable environments, that continues through this discourse of external market variation.
Absolutely. And my background is actually in human rights. And so that's why I'm so deeply motivated by this work, because I truly believe that in order to realize any human right, you must be able to provide for yourself. You must be able to feed, put a roof over your head, and then you can really exercise freedom of speech and so many other human rights that are important.
It's very basic. One of the things, and I'd like to just cover off on this point as we get into just the basic idea of being human and what we need. Mm. There's often this conversation on this topic of DEI that if it doesn't say it directly, it implies that when we start to focus on DEI, then we invariably begin to compromise on the hiring bar. And that within itself is a bias.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
That within itself is a bias, because it then sets up this paradigm that we're at risk now if we start to be inclusive. But when we disaggregate the data And we look at one organization's needs versus another, their headcount needs, their demand needs versus another. If we see an organization that has 200 need headcount versus an organization that has 20,000 need headcount, and we start to look within demographic of available talent in the United States, we've got to get very prescriptive about available talent in the United States, mechanisms that we might use, talent marketing and external branding initiatives, direct sourcing actions and reactions for talent within the organization, unconscious bias training across the organization for candidate engagement. That's where the work is. There's a lot of bias and inflammation around even the topic. Really, again, when it comes, if we could look at the system and look at the data, that's when we would determine how to solve this problem.
Yes. And I mean, I would even argue that this is something that's even deeper rooted than just the recruiting process.
Of course.
Right. It's like, how do we even build out pipelines and get different diverse groups excited about learning these concepts? So, for example, like engineering. Mm-hmm. My co-founder there, Nikita, she actually was just billboard all down in New York City. And the whole campaign was, I'm the CTO. Yeah. And she's an incredible leader. She co-founded Girls Who Code and Ithaca. And I think it's so important that we get more folks earlier on in their career excited about these pipelines. So I think it's like really starting out and having a much more holistic approach to this whole strategy from the beginning.
Right. There are so many organizations getting this right these days on inclusion. Like, again, Baker Tilly, who's won one of the top organizations for belonging in the world this year. BlackRock, again, doing tremendous work. They're not faking it until they're making it. They are actually organizations that are invested in holistic people strategies that ensure as much as possible that there's great representation and folks are feeling great about being within that particular culture.
Thank you for giving us hope. I think, like you said, the media can be sensationalized, and sometimes we feel like we're making so many steps backwards after all this progress we feel like we had. So it brings me hope, and I am motivated to continue the impact and work that we're having. And on this podcast, our whole mission around open up the workforce to us at Symba means a future of work that's equitable and creates access for all of us to create wealth, not just employment. And we'd love to get your perspective on what you think is the necessary steps that leaders need to take in order to truly open up the workforce.
Well, it comes down to the leadership mindset of first of all, understanding the societal implications of having an environment that does not cultivate inclusion. So I think any leader who's a strong leader understands what's happening in the world. The folks that come in for interviews that are on teams, we're in the world. Mm-hmm. So understanding how external implications impact individuals is important, but also whether a leader is in HR or talent acquisition or DEI, ensuring that there are alliances of understanding within that people strategy are important. What is our external brand currently around inclusion? What is our turnover rate for underrepresented folks? Have we determined, whether there are real root causes? Is there opportunity for an organization to have an unconscious bias training? Mm-hmm. How do we educate our environment overall to make this a less inflammatory topic? And how do we ensure also that the conversations about DEI are inclusive? It's that middle path about what it means to be human element based as a leader, what it means to include, how to measure it, and how to continuously improve programs around inclusion so that individuals and organizations can thrive.
That was so well said. And those questions that you asked, I think that that's something that all of us should be thinking about behind the back of our minds. And that's a call to action, truly.
Sure.
I truly believe it is. And I want to say thank you so much for being with us, for doing this podcast live. Thank you to our live audience.
Thank you
all for participating. It's been really such an incredible experience. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our audience with before we wrap up today?
No, just thankful for the amount of attention that is going to the topic. I'm in the media is often referring to me as a trailblazer and a pioneer. I have not been able to look at a people's strategy in a compartmentalized way. So that's really been the foundation of my success across big corporate. The mission of my organization is very unique. We're the only organization in the world that offers talent acquisition while interweaving DEI solutions. I don't believe we'll be the last. And I'm just excited, even in spite of what's happening in the ambiguous spaces that some society is on this. I'm excited and sure that we're heading true north on the topics.
Thank you. I feel like this is the optimism and hope that we all need, especially right now in this period.
Sure.
Thank you so much again, Nikita. It was wonderful to have you on the show. And thank you to JFF for having us. It's been awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.